So the concept for this episode is monopolies within monopolies within monopolies. Uh, this is kind of here to talk about. It's not my notes are not loading on my cloud, so I'll pull it up on my phone. It's to talk about American political power and the birth of the 1950s top sets. So the idea here for this is you have a couple of different things that happen around the mid 50s. And I'll couch this by what happens that actually births the modern baseball card in 1909 with the T206 and the monopoly that happens with American tobacco, right? And the antitrust suit that breaks it up. Um, this is something, this is 1911. They quickly crowd out the market, as I said, because of their automated cigarette roller, right? That they bought from a worker from actually a rival company. They bought out his innovation, and they quickly dominated the market just because they could produce cigarettes faster, 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 quicker, and quicker, with better quality as well. Um, and they inevitably, right, the whole antitrust thing that happens at the onset of the 20th century with a lot of the industrial things that happen in the country at the time, right? There's this increased technology, and people start to corner market shares, right? This is the whole J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, Henry Ford. There's massive industrial revolution that's occurring in the country. So you have this political moment where industries are becoming monopolized by superpowers, super industrial powers. And also, this is not just limited, of course, to the nation of the United States. This is becoming a global political problem, right? So this goes into World War One, World War Two, and what happens after those two wars? You basically have a bookend historically, right? The historical bookend is 1909, the deadball era, and then you have this massive world war, and then another massive world war immediately afterwards, and then you come out on the other side of that bookend in the 40s, 50s, right? So this is where it gets fascinating because it's almost like there's an immediate bridge that occurs from the T206 innovation, which is directly connected to American tobacco, right? Which is a industrial superpower of tobacco production, the primary cultural enjoyment of the entire American country, right? Cigarettes are just absolutely huge, and they're huge until even going into the later part of the 1900s. You have that on one end, World War One, World War Two, and then you have this emergence into an era where America has essentially monopolized the world global stage. Right? It's no exaggeration to say after World War II that America has, in many ways, almost conquered the world. Right? I want to kind of allude to Alexander the Great and his historical project. You almost have that is what happens at the end of World War II, right? America emerges clearly not only on the side of the victors, but perhaps the chief victor itself, and with all of the political power and might that comes with that in terms of resources, its international constituents, right? Whether those are pseudo colonies or just political seedings of power that are occurring around the globe to America after that war. Um, this is when you have a monopoly within a monopoly within a monopoly. You have the monopoly of American world power. You have one of the only monopolies that's actually ever been allowed in America. Maybe actually the only one. I'm not sure. I'm not. That's not my area of expertise. But Major League Baseball, right? This goes back to what I was talking about with the Federal League and the whole antitrust suit that happens with the Federal League a decade after the American tobacco antitrust suit, where it gets broken up and it gets turned into, it's like the Reynolds Cigarette Company, and there's a bunch of other ones. You can actually still see a lot of the old American tobacco factories in North Carolina and Virginia. They're all still there. Some of them have been converted into apartment buildings and things like that. A lot of them are. But anyways, you have monopoly within monopoly within monopoly. Um, the MLB wins that antitrust suit, and it's a legal monopoly, which is just insane, right? Against the Federal League. The Federal League is saying that MLB is making it impossible to hire players because they just buy them right back. And they're saying, Major League Baseball is it's almost like declaring a national park is almost what happens. It gets declared America's pastime as an institution, but it's obviously there's a lot of private ownership power there that you can see to this day. Right, some of the richest people in the country own these baseball teams. So you have one monopoly, America, the world power, emerging after World War II. This has essentially monopolized the global scene, and you see a lot of the stuff that occurs afterwards. In terms of the prosperity of the country, which is very brief because of how the political and economic situation is handled, it's almost an embarrassment of riches, and the country squanders it due to just poor management. But so you have that. Then you have another layer, which is Major League Baseball, as we discussed. It's a legal monopoly as of the 1920s. Negro leagues get seeded into that. Obviously, all the federal league stuff gets seeded into that, and it's over. It's a lot of the best Cuban players, Venezuelan players, obviously Puerto Rican players, they all come to the United States, as well as Japan, elsewhere, right? This is something that it's set into motion by the larger political and economic circumstances of the globe at the time. And then, within that monopoly, you have another monopoly, which is the Topps baseball cards. Right, the 1950s and 60s sets. Topps buys up Bowman at the beginning of the 50s, middle of the 50s, and it turns into this monolithic cultural product. This is where it gets really interesting, right? Because you can almost say, due to the utter singularity of these monopolies, they're almost public institutions that are owned privately. So it's an interesting economic concept because you have a lot of economic and political ideologies that you could say a lot of things and call these things a lot of things, but when you have that level of cultural monopoly of product, as in Topps or as in Major League Baseball, and post integration, right, which is also crucial. You have players from all over the world coming to play in this league. It's almost in the way that the Smithsonian is a cultural product, which is both privately and publicly backed. It's almost an institution of culture and of humanism, right? So I really want to kind of set that stage and establish that, because if you look at things through that framework, you have the institution of Major League Baseball and the institution of Topps. Topps is the sort of, I don't know, you could call it like the White House painter, or the painter for the national painter, so to speak. It's the representative image-making institution that creates the cultural object to sum up and distill the cultural ambiance of the essence of the public institution of baseball itself. And this is really powerful, right? Because if you contextualize things this way, I was thinking about this in terms of the history of baseball, the full history of it. It's something that could never truly be told because there are the roots of so many different interweaving stories, both national and international. It's such a broad thing that it's more of like a poetry than it is a history, because you could never truly sum it up. Because even when you look at someone like Dizzy Dean or Satchel Paige, there's such a mythic full history of that individual, right? That mythic full history of that individual intersects with a large public denomination of people who are experiencing the legacy and the legend that's playing out on the public stage, that is the Gas House Gang of 1934, or Satchel Paige with the Monarchs, or as he enters the major leagues or goes down to play in Cuba. So you have this very, very, very broad mythic tree, right, with branches and roots that reach far beyond any one historian or even an institution of history could ever possibly sum up, right? There's the experience that many individual people have that are personal experiences of baseball. Someone told me this experience that they had of walking through a neighborhood, and there was no AC at this period of time, and there were just everyone was playing the baseball game through their open windows, right, just to get some cool air in. So you could hear the baseball game walking through the neighborhood as you passed multiple different houses, right? I've found some pictures from Cuban magazines of the kids playing stickball in the streets, right, just in the dirt in the streets. You have all of these different memories that constitute the real history of baseball. And the legacy is just an attempt to distill that. So that's a lot of what historical work and archival work is and attempts to do, which is to recover the full body of that history, although obviously never possible, right? You're always reaching into the unknown to a certain extent. But it's also the importance of the tops, the creation of tops as a sort of chronicler of the national pastime. You have magazines like Baseball Magazine, or in Cuba, you have Bohemia Magazine. Um, all of these different ways, newspapers, obviously, the New York Times, that are capturing and distilling and conveying and communicating the language of baseball across the nation and across the globe. But when you look at cultural artifacts, and this is what's so powerful about what happened with Tops, and what's ultimately so important about, I'm going to say this, it's almost like the public institution as a monopoly, right? There's a certain point where there's a cultural institution or a cultural history that needs to uh, achieve this status of being exempt, which is really powerful. The Tops company, with all of the economic thrust that's behind it, it's an entirely individual. For the 50s and 60s, you have some kind of brief interlocutions of, you have like, I think like 63 Fleer, and you obviously have regional releases and bread releases and things like that. But when you're looking at the full body of what constitutes baseball cards at the most kind of epic high point of American civilization in terms of its global international power and cultural reach, as well as the full body of baseball as soon as it comes into the period of integration and post-integration, um, you're looking at something that's so culturally distilled. Again, 1950s, it's Giants, Dodgers, Yankees, right? It's the Battle of New York. It comes back full circle. It's, interestingly enough, right? You look at that period and connect it to 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, which is, again, it's the Battle of New York before mid-century, which is the Giants and the Yankees, the series of consecutive World Series. And then the Yankees ultimately win out. They have Yankee Stadium. They have, right, they have Babe Ruth's contract. They have, let me think, what else? 1927 World Series, Murderers Row. You go into the 30s, right? Babe Ruth's called shot. The Yankees at this point are like a national cultural institution. It's like they win out that Battle of New York, but then it comes back up again in the 50s. It happens actually 30s, 40s, but it's just so big in the 50s with Jackie Robinson, Pee Wee Reese, and the Dodgers, as well as Willie Mays and the Giants. And then obviously you have Rizzuto, the end of DiMaggio's career. You got Mantle, you got Maris, right? So this is just the core. And the reason why I point to New York is because it's the industrial and media cultural supercenter of the United States. As I said before, it was, and you could still say is in a lot of ways, the world's capital, right? Not only for industry, but for culture. So this is kind of what I'm working around here, this idea of monopoly within monopoly within monopoly. And if you want to take it to that next level, it's New York City, the Yankees, Dodgers, Giants, and then ultimately the Yankees. And that's all like a condensation of political and economic power. And that's so much of what the legacy of the United States has been about. It's political and economic power, which obviously, as you can see, has little to no concern with ethics or moral standing, and is much more to do with the accumulation of power at all costs. So you can see a lot of the cognitive dissonance that happens there when the United States says it's doing something for maybe moral or humanitarian purposes, but it ends up just being for political purposes, right? This what we're kind of talking about here is the cultural institution of baseball as it represents the sort of American mythic cultural subconscious of the entire community, or the ideological backing of the principle and idea of America itself. It's kind of difficult to talk about, but I mean, the Constitution, again, is a great example, right? It says one thing, and the political reality of America is the accumulation of power at all costs for those who are in positions of aristocratic standing in the country, right? And so you kind of look at the cultural outputs that come from that, and I'm not necessarily saying anything is either good or bad, right? I'm looking at this from a place of the attempt to understand history, what comes out of America, I would argue, first and foremost, is baseball. You have Hollywood, of course, as I said before, but when you look at baseball as a cultural institution that embodied the American mythic heroic identity, and it played out in real time the attempt to create a mythic cultural history. What happens in the 50s with Topps, with America emerging out of World War II, and the integration of baseball, you have a sort of high point which emerges through a tension and a contradiction and a paradox, which is you have the full fledging of the cultural institution of baseball, which had for so long been in development. It's been like a century and a half in utero, or no, more like a century in utero. But you have baseball, which is a century in utero, right? It's building, it's developing, it's creating its identity, and then all of a sudden you hit the 50s post World War II, and everything falls into place. And I don't think it's a mistake that it does when it does, because that's also when American civilization reaches its high point, right? And it reaches its high point through the creation of global war, global conflict, where the real stakes of the world are being mapped out for the first and second time in history with World War I and World War II. Again, totally, utterly unprecedented. You could talk about Persia, you could talk about Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan, but never to that extent had the world been in a place of conflict, musical chairs, so to speak, right? So what comes out of that is America as the youngest, really one of the youngest nations on the scene, or one of the youngest, emerges with an identity that's almost arbitrated through war. And it's interesting to see the parallels between war and baseball, especially in regards to people like Ted Williams, or how baseball intersects with the war in terms of how magazines and newspapers convey information to the American public. They're very intertwined. But you see the real soul of America represented primarily in baseball, not through war. And I think Hollywood is more of like a commercial industry of dreams, right? That's the heart and soul of America is manifest through baseball, through the striving that's there, whether it's Phil Rizzuto or Jackie Robinson or Lou Gehrig, Babe Ruth. These are American cultural histories, right? Babe Ruth is a great example in terms of his childhood, right? Coming from a foster home, very troubled child, and throughout his life dealt with a lot of very significant psychological, physical, mental difficulties and setbacks, but created this larger than life mythic persona through his play on the baseball field. So you see this, it's this sort of cultural theater in the way of the Romans or the Greeks, through which you rise mythically, or through sport and through athleticism and through engagement with life on real active terms. It's a very almost like the Greek god Ares, or the Roman god Mars, right? It's almost that kind of theme. It's things are playing out through America's development, or the ideation and utero stage of America's development through that active principle. Let me think. So to go back to the Monopolies thing, there's almost this transcendental alignment that occurs there in the 50s with Topps, with America emerging from global conflict as this sort of international victor, the monopoly of Major League Baseball and its full integration, the full integration happening at that time, and this the mid-century New York City baseball identity. Jackie Robinson, Willie Mays, Mickey Mantle, right? There's this sort of mythic core that reaches its utter height at that period of time, and it's just fascinating to see how it manifests through. I think the lens is really, again, the baseball card, and that's why I keep coming back to that topic, because it's the way in which the myth is represented, and it's condensed and coalesced through multiple different things. The T206, which again is the first modern baseball card, or the big modern baseball card that emerges at that industrial pivot point, which we discussed right before World War I. You have that unfolding of the history of the baseball card, the T206 to Tops. And you can see a lot of those early caramel and tobacco releases and what Tops does, especially in terms of the flat colors and the cutout players. Um, that's developing. Major League Baseball is developing, right, from the late 1800s through the segregation period, through the Cuban leagues and the Negro leagues to the ultimate integration. You have that, which culminates there. And then you have the larger history of American civilization itself, which is developing from the Constitution to the period of internal conflict through slavery and segregation in the 1800s, through the period of global war turmoil in which people of all creeds and colors engaged in this war, and then ultimately the integration in the 50s, and then this period of intense civil fomenting in the civil rights movement, which Jackie Robinson was a big part of, as well as the massive like cultural social changes that happened in the 60s, connected especially to the Vietnam War, Kennedy, Cuba. Again, big theme. Cuba comes in. So you can see the network that I'm trying to draw here. There's this massive intersection between baseball history, American history, and world history. It's a picture that could probably never truly be summed up in terms of its magnitude and the difference and the contrasts that occur within it. But you can see how important it is that Cuba goes through its independence movement at the end of the 1800s, really intersecting a lot of with what the U.S. Civil War movement is. The Cuba independence movement is a national liberation movement as well as an abolition of slavery movement. Spanish-American War, and then the Spanish-American War right at that 1900 period, leap forward into the 50s and 60s, Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy, Castro, right? They're themes that are emerging, receding, and emerging in relationship to baseball. So when you look at American history through the lens of baseball, you're able to see America's attempt to come into being, right? To self-realize and self-actualize. It's the medium through which America is actualizing, the same way that maybe an artist has a paintbrush or a musician has a guitar, right? For America, the medium of actualization is baseball. It's a very, very nuanced and subtle thing. And so when you look through the lens of a historian or a philosopher or an archivist at baseball, you're looking at how is baseball representing itself? Not presenting itself in terms of the action on the field and this and that, but rather how is it representing itself in terms of its cultural artifacts, right? And so there's a couple of different ways to look at that. You have the photographs, which are, it's not baseball representing itself, it's the news capturing baseball. You have newsprint, similar thing, television. These are all things that first that you could kind of say, this is baseball representing itself, but you have to look for like a mythic distillation of the image, and that's usually iconographic. It's not literal. It's not documentary. So when you look for that iconographic imagery, what you find is the baseball card. So the history of the baseball card, right, is the history of the image representation of the American self as it is in the period of its most intense formative development, which is 1900 to 1950 or 1960, in terms of not only its national identity, right, because now we're attempting to distill national liberation, abolition of slavery, with a rapidly emerging industrial global environment, and create and cultivate a collective identity that is not segregationist, it's not isolationist, it's involved in a global community. So you can see how for a young nation that's immediately jarring. There's very little time that America exists in a regional period of privacy, right, as opposed to Italy or China or Greece. These are areas, they've existed for hundreds of thousands of years. They had regional relationships, sometimes more international, like with the Silk Road. There's a lot of different areas that are coming into relationship in the Silk Road. But you understand what I'm saying in terms of the world historical intersection of the United States' developmental phase. So that's essentially it. So when we look at the 50s, I'm just going to reiterate it one last time. You have basically the height of American political power in terms of the international revolution of the end of World War I and World War II, where America emerges clearly, I think, as the almost undisputed global victor of that conflict, even within the victorious faction of the Allies, right? Um, the birth of the absolutely condensed, consolidated, typified modern baseball card with tops, right? It's been totally condensed and consolidated. The entire history of baseball card has been presented through one institution, really, which is also a private company, which is Topps. And the baseball is allowed to be a monopoly as of the 1920s, but it becomes America's national cultural institution in a entirely integrated and holistic way when integration occurs, right? 47, Jackie Robinson, technically the official integration of baseball, and then obviously into the 50s, Larry Doby, Minoso, right? So that's the episode there. I hope you enjoyed this. It's a big picture perspective, and there's a lot of moving parts, but I think you can see the picture that I'm painting with a broad brush here. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you on the next one.